So, we're about to explore a version of our origins that, well, it questions pretty much everything we've been taught. I want you to consider this. What if that garden we remember as Eden wasn't a beginning at all? What if it was just a story designed to cover up a memory, one that was far, far older and way more violent than we've ever been allowed to believe?
I mean, were we simply survivors of ancient cosmic wars, just trying to endure? Could we be the aftermath of a catastrophe rather than some deliberate design? You look at the asteroid belt. Is that just debris? Or is it the remains of a ruined world, one that ancient texts called Tiamat? And what about our moon? Was it always there? Or was it a late arrival, a silent witness pulled into our orbit only after all the damage had been done?
Now, these are not just poetic questions. You can find variations of these stories again and again in Sumerian, Vedic, Greek, and Egyptian records. They were preserved as myth only after centralized powers came along and stripped them of their historical legitimacy, recasting them as simple allegory, rather than what they may have actually been, memory. The whole idea of Eden seems to echo much earlier Sumerian texts. But here's the thing. In those records, these sacred enclosures weren't moral testing grounds. Not at all. They were described as regulated spaces, almost like intersection points for different worlds, different beings, and different bloodlines. When you look at it that way, the entire meaning flips. It stops being a story about human failure and becomes a story about a cosmic crossroads. And this might sound a little strange, but ancient cultures all across the globe preserve a memory of a time before the moon. Seriously. Greek sources talk about the proselenes, which literally means the people who lived before the moon was in our sky. Akkadian traditions remember a time when the heavens just looked different. And what's wild is how remarkably consistent these accounts are, even across cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of years. This shattered origin story is really just part of a much larger theme, an idea of recurring cycles of destruction, or resets. You can find this pattern in countless ancient traditions, long before any central authority could have tried to rewrite history. And they all tell a very similar story. There was a lost golden age, followed by a sudden, catastrophic collapse. And I mean, the pattern is just everywhere. You've got the Sumerian flood, the Hindu cycles of Pralaya, the Norse Ragnarok, the Hopi emergence stories, Mayan civilization collapses, and of course, Plato's account of Atlantis. They all talk about floods, about fire from the sky, about a world that was fundamentally different before some great reset. Different languages, different symbols, but the memory of the same rupture is still there. Which brings us to a crucial point. The loss of knowledge is part of the pattern. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, that wasn't an accident. It was a feature of the system. Knowledge that challenges power is always the first casualty. So when advanced civilizations fall, their records are destroyed, leaving behind only these fragments the future generations like us are taught to just dismiss as mere myth. And you know what? Geology actually backs this up. The story of Atlantis sinking in a single day and night aligns, well, uncomfortably well with the younger Dryas event. This was a well-documented period of abrupt global climate disruption. We can see it in ice core data, in sediment layers, in sea level records, and they all point to a sudden, catastrophic change, not a gradual one. Ancient texts say a god killed the planet Tiamat with an evil wind. What was that? I mean, ancient people didn't have our scientific language. They had metaphor. So could this have been their way of describing something they actually witnessed? A devastating solar storm, a plasma event, or maybe a coronal mass ejection? And this leads us to how these powerful memories got hijacked. After these resets, new rulers would often position themselves as being divinely chosen. They introduced a simple but incredibly powerful story to control the survivors, a binary narrative of good versus evil. It's a framework perfectly designed to make us outsource our own moral authority and just stop thinking for ourselves. You know, when we hear a term like archons, we might immediately think of monsters or horned demons, but the concept appears explicitly in Gnostic texts, and it doesn't describe that at all. It describes the rulers of systems, the puppeteers, you could say, the ones controlling things from behind the curtain. It's a similar story with the Watchers from the Enochian writings. They're another example. They're described as overseers who interfere with human development. And you have to remember, these ideas weren't fringe when they were written. They were later erased, suppressed, or reframed by those who came into power. This binary, this framing of everything as a battle between good and evil, is the absolute core of the control system, and its relentless promotion is not accidental.
It is, perhaps, the single most effective control mechanism ever designed. It works by creating obedient populations, by destroying our trust in our own inner authority.
And the process is brutally effective. First, you convince people to outsource their moral authority to an external power, a priest, a king, an institution. Second, you redefine independent thought as disobedience or even heresy. And finally, you enforce compliance through the fear of punishment. It's a simple and devastatingly effective system.
But all of this, it just raises a critical question, doesn't it? What if there is another path? What were the original spiritual teachings that were suppressed? The ones that didn't point to external saviors, but pointed inward, toward reclaiming our own spiritual sovereignty. If you look at these texts, the Vedas, the Pyramid texts, the Gnostic Gospels, they all predate the finalized biblical canon, and they consistently emphasize concepts that were later removed, things like direct contact with source, inner knowing, personal responsibility, and yes, reincarnation.
Just consider the contrast. The original teacher, Yeshua, a name that literally means to rescue, spoke of inner sovereignty, compassion, and direct connection to source. His core message was that the kingdom of God is within you. The institutions that later claimed his name turned that message completely inside out, demanding external obedience, intermediaries, fear, and money.
Even the word sin was twisted. Before dogma redefined it, it just meant to miss the mark. It was an archery term. It was all about alignment, about course correction, not about being evil or deserving eternal damnation. This forces us to ask a really critical question. Why was the concept of reincarnation systematically removed from public teaching? Why were personal guiding spirits, known as daimons, recast as evil demons? Why was the idea of direct communication with Source branded as heresy? The answer is simple. These teachings empower the individual, and that threatens systems of control. And this is exactly why your personal discernment is so sacred. Because belief without discernment is how we build our own invisible cages. Just chasing the truth doesn't protect you from deception, especially when that deception is wrapped in holy language or promises of salvation. True discernment is your shield. So let's be perfectly clear. God, Source, the Great Spirit, whatever name you use, does not need your fear, it does not need your money, and it absolutely does not require intermediaries. The demand for tithes, obedience, and submission has always been a control mechanism designed by human institutions. This is not what Source wanted you to learn here. You were meant to experience life, to learn, to grow, not to play some rigged game that rewards obedience and punishes awareness. The fear script was never the original lesson plan for humanity. The path forward isn't found in books that were rewritten by the victors of ancient wars. The answers aren't with the middlemen who sell you a version of God that requires your fear and your money to function. The authority you've been searching for has been inside you all along. Wake up.